What's up, guys? Let's talk about samurai. Someone suggested that I do the history of samurai in a comment on the other video, so here we go. This is actually going to be perfect because it will then segue directly into the next video, which is going to be in this series, which I will tell you about once you have watched it. Long time ago, we're talking the Asuka period, which was like quite a long time ago. Japan was like trying to fight with Korea, and they had a whole lot of stuff going on with them, and they just decided, you know what, we need to get out of this, rather wisely, because they were sort of getting stomped on. And so in 663 AD, Japan pulled out of Korea and was like, okay, we're done with this now. We need to make some reforms in our own country before we go and try to invade someone else's. They instituted a census, which meant that like every, I think it was 4 years, like all the males had to go and register where they were and like how many was in their family and whatnot. And that led to the draft, which stated that 1 in every 3 to 4 men served a military position for some point in time. This also established a sort of like rank system where like you had emperor and then 12 ranks under that. And like, you know, rank number 1 was like second hand to the emperor, and rank number 2 was like third hand to the emperor. And then down, once you get to rank 6 and below were called samurai. And they sort of just like dealt with, you know, everyday life stuff, the kind of things that you'd see, like traffic court in like modern day, that kind of thing. It was at this point that the word samurai like got invented, but it had absolutely nothing to do with the sort of militaristic, like sword wielding, peasant cutting samurai that we know. So after the Asuka period, we then had the Heian period, which is where Emperor Kammu comes around. And Emperor Kammu basically had a shitty army. He had this army that, like, he went to go and try, like, up in Honshu to, like, beat back the people that were up there and expand his own territory, but his army sucked, and they didn't do shit. And they sort of just, like, flopped around and were like, we have no discipline and we don't really give a shit about anything, so we're gonna lose these fights. And so Kammu was like, okay, we're gonna do something about that. So he made this title, Seitai Shogun, which is, like, a military title that, like, had power over the army, essentially. And it's not really like a government position just yet. They don't recognize it for that for like another couple hundred years. But this was the position that caused people to start following, as a military, following under basically one guy. And that was the Seitai Shogun. And he basically mobilized the clans that lived around him, and they started to fight on horseback and use bows and arrows, and they started wrecking shit. So once they started like actually concentrating on their fighting studies, as it were, they started kicking a bunch of ass, and then Emperor Kammu had a pretty good military. Unfortunately, Kammu sucked as an emperor, and so he started losing power, so he had to disband the military. And the military, while Kammu still had enough power as an emperor to do anything about it, they took like high government positions for like ministers and that kind of thing. The relatives of the people who'd taken the minister's position then became like magistrates, that kind of thing, so they started being able to like write the laws that were in local areas and whatnot. And if you give someone the power to write laws, they're going to instate taxes because everyone wants money. And so in order to try to amass the sort of like wealth that they used to have as the army, but then no longer had because they weren't army anymore, they like instated these huge like taxes and tariffs and whatnot, and they basically stood on a hill and pissed on all the farmers, because if you couldn't pay for it with money, they took land instead, and you can't farm if you haven't got land. So they would send like, you know, essentially these people who used to be military down to the like farmers' lands and beat the farmers with, you know, rods and things until the farmers would then give up the pieces of land that they quote-unquote owed to these assholes. So the farmers decided that that wasn't cool, and they started taking up arms. And they like put on like old Japanese armor and used like old school Japanese weapons. and they sort of like naturally became clans on their own right. And it is said that this is where the concept of Bushido began. The whole, like, the idea that, like, you have to be an honorable combatant and all that sort of thing. Probably out of the, like, desire to not be like the asshole tax collectors that are coming and screwing their land up and all that. So that's where we have that kind of first mobilization of the peasantry against the government, which is going to show up hundreds of times everywhere. But at least in this one, that peasantry is going to become the government. But in any case, these sort of like clans of farmers gained enough fame and power from kicking enough asses that started gaining political clout. One of them, I forget which clan, but they gained the power to appoint a police force made up of the warriors that were like protecting their lands like that. That sort of police force grew in responsibility and power and more responsibility and more power and more responsibility and more power until the samurai, which is what they called themselves there, became the ruling class. And that's where militarized samurai first came about. This was a couple hundred years after the Asuka period. Enter the Kamakura bakufu. The guy who made the police force originally, whose name I still don't remember, set up the Kamakura bakufu in 1192. And that was the first government that was entirely controlled by the samurai. Like a specifically military, samurai-only government. There was a bunch of, you know, power grabbing and like lineage-based inheritance trouble title things. Like all of the clans sort of like wanted to be the big power in this new shogunate. And this ended up culminating in a duel between like the two rival clans. You had the Minamoto clan and the Taira clan. They just fought, and they fought, and they fought, and they fought, and they fought, and this was the Heiji Rebellion. During the Heiji Rebellion, the Taira clan won, and Taira, the head of the Taira clan, became an imperial advisor, and eventually that imperial advisor sort of stepped behind the emperor and kicked him off of the throne and down the stairs and seized power, and then there really wasn't that much of an emperor thing anymore. He became a sort of figurehead, much in the same way that like the Queen of England is right now. Because you have the Prime Minister and then you have the Queen. Here you had Taira and the Emperor. The Taira clan sort of usurped the entire country at that point. That caused the Minamoto clan to be like, okay, no, we're not gonna let that happen, fuck that, and they got up and fought again with the Taira clan. This time, it worked. The Genpei War is what that second fight was called. And Minamoto and his entire clan like had been preparing for this. Because when the Taira clan came into power, they didn't really keep themselves militarized. They sort of did things like in a bureaucratic kind of way, where they, you know, worked towards doing things via reforms and laws and stuff, but the Minamotos were like, we're just gonna keep practicing. And then they came back and they kicked the ass out of the Taira clan. And they stomped that shit. Like, the Minamoto clan had no contest here. And that was where the Kamakura bakufu got instated. Was the Minamoto clan instituted the shogunate. They were like, okay, screw it. This is the beginning of the bakufu, and you guys suck, and you weren't military anymore, so we kicked your asses, and now it's a military government. Fuck you. And so that's where the samurai warrior class became nobility. So you had the samurai before, but before the Kamakura bakufu, they were just soldiers. At this point, they became nobility, plus soldiers, divided by 2. They rose in ranks and became the aristocracy, and the pre-existing aristocracy saw this, and they thought, shit, now there's a bunch of bloodthirsty warriors that are in the aristocracy, what should we do? And so they sort of introduced, like, high-class hobbies and things to the samurai, things like calligraphy and flower arranging and writing and music and that kind of thing. And so those samurai that were like warmongery suddenly were like, oh, okay, we're aristocrats now, we can do this sort of like highbrow, takes a lot of money to do kind of stuff. And in response, the aristocracy that was already there started adopting more of the samurai traditions as well, making them all into one big sort of conglomerate of aristocratic warrior types. And that saved the pre-existing aristocracy from getting their heads cut off, and it made the samurai into actual aristocrats and not just these people who like cutting people. Kamakura shogunate stops there, and the Ashikaga shogunate starts here. Bang! Buddhism comes in! Like the other video, which is the first video of this series, which you can click here. I'll probably put a link to it or something. But this is super important here, because a bunch of clans at this point, this is right before the Sengoku Jidai, a bunch of clans started wanting more power, because the Kamakura shogunate, which was headed by the Minamoto clan, sort of didn't give the power back to anyone else, that kind of thing. They seized power and then just held on to it. And the other clans were like, but we're big and strong too. And Minamoto was like, yeah, we don't care, we're the bakufu. And the other clans were like, okay, so we're gonna probably beat you up. And they started fighting in between themselves. And that's where you get the Ashikaga shogunate. The concept of Buddhism here is super, super important, because while Bushido was a thing, and, you know, was still, like, there, I guess, the main important thing was that a lot of people using Buddhism were able to come to terms with the fact that death was a thing. And it allowed the, like, warrior class to not really care about dying. Which is why in the old period dramas you see a lot of samurai warriors being like, immediately, okay, I did something bad, I'm gonna kill myself. Blurk. Because they know that they're gonna be reincarnated, because they were a relatively, you know, a good person and they followed the Confucian ideals and all that kind of thing. So Buddhism here was like the impetus to make people go out and die at the hands of the sword, essentially. During this time, the Ashikaga shogunate, China decided that they wanted to invade Japan. Twice. And the first time, they got, like, way more than Japan could possibly have mustered. And so they're coming in with this boat, like this set of boats, and there's so many of these warriors, and Japan got, like, 10,000 samurai. And that was all they could really muster because, you know, that's all that they really had at the time. They all stood there on the coast, and they were waiting, and then all of a sudden, a huge typhoon comes and smashes the Chinese army, the Yuan dynasty. They get, like, wrecked. Their ships get destroyed, and, like, most of their people get killed in this inclement weather. And the people that do end up finally getting to the coast of Japan are repelled by the Japanese soldiers that were there, because they had, you know, pretty good fighting skills and all that. But both sides lost quite a percentage of their troops. This was the first time that gunpowder was used in Japan, because the Yuan dynasty had developed bombs, which they threw at the Japanese, and they blew up, and they took the Japanese with them. So Japan saw these sort of, like, exploding balls for the first time, and it probably blew their minds. But in any case, they managed to fight these dudes back. And they said, okay, what if they come back? We need something that will help us. So they built a wall. The harbor that the Chinese had tried to come into, they just built like a 20-kilometer long wall that closed that thing off, essentially. And then they mustered more samurai, and they started training more and all that. And lo and behold, China decides, okay, let's try this again. They sent an approximate 400,000 soldiers, and Japan could get, they had 100,000. So, 400,000 Chinese soldiers, 100,000 samurai. And China's like, okay, so last time, storm and everything, that sucked. This time we're gonna, you know, go in there and we're gonna stomp on the Japanese. And the Japanese are like, we built a wall, we're ready for you. And lo and behold, the Chinese get close and a monsoon hits. And this huge tsunami, like, crushes a bunch of the boats, and a bunch of the Chinese warriors get dunked. And it happens all again, and China at this point is like, alright, fuck it, we're done. We're not gonna mess with this anymore. So we're out of here, have fun, Japan. And Japan's like, woo, the wall helped us because we could, you know, beat back the people that did get to land using the defenses from the wall, but the wind that caused the storms and whatnot helped us as well. this is where you get the term kamikaze, which does not in fact have anything to do with being a suicide bomber. The word itself just literally means divine wind, or like wind of the gods, or kami. They're just referring to the fact that this sort of wind basically saved the country from getting invaded and taken over by China. Twice in a row. And what are the odds of that, right? You get, then, after, Japan sitting back and thinking, okay, so we managed to repel these people, but it was only by the good graces of the god of wind that we were able to do so. We need better stuff. We need better weapons, we need better armor. And along comes this guy named Masamune, who is not Sephiroth's sword from Final Fantasy VII, but is in fact a swordsmith. He basically took some hard steel and some soft steel and went blurk, 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 and hit it a whole bunch, and it became this amazing, strong, flexible sword that all of a sudden, like, just took off. And it was sharp, and it kept an edge, and it was really good at cutting stuff. And Japan suddenly had some of the best swords on that half of the planet. And they made their, like, some of these basically heirloom swords made it as far over as India, because of how good these fucking swords were. So, there you have it. Masamune is a real person, not just a name that they threw into Final Fantasy. So, you know, good on that. Unfortunately, they didn't get to use these swords on invaders, because they started using them on each other. And that's where the actual Sengoku period begins. So, all the states that had been fighting before, that then tried to unify to beat off the Chinese attackers, haha, I said beat off, went back to fighting each other. Again, this is where the Warring States period starts. The whole inheritance-based, like, family lines, and the being, like, the daimyo of the clans, all of that caused so much trouble that they all just started trying to kill each other and trying to be the dominant clan in Japan. So one clan would attack the other, and then they would win or something, but then that clan would come back later and attack the first one with the help of a third one, who would then backstab the second one, and it was just a whole lot of extra fighting and stupid. And basically nobody won for a very, very long time. So it was at this point that Bushido became super important, because it was the way that the, like, clan leaders could impose a moral and, like, governing system on their warriors, their samurai. And, like, this is the, like, you always see the period dramas, where they're always talking about, like, it is the way of the Bushido, the Bushi, it is the way of the Buke, and that's because at this point, the governing bodies were using it to control their people. So, you know, you got a whole lot of, samurai, like, morality here, I guess, for lack of a better word. It was also during this period that foot soldiers started getting, put together. So instead of, like, the clans warring with, you know, a couple thousand people each, they then started conscripting people who weren't samurai, just these random, like, you know, peasants, and giving them long-ass, like, spears or naginata or something like that, because the sword was a samurai thing only, using them. So they started going from battles between thousands to battles between hundreds of thousands of people. Lots and lots and lots of people got killed at this point, and I bet you that the population of Japan was reduced at least by half, just with all the random killing that got done because they started using people who weren't really soldiers. So this is where a lot of the weeaboos are gonna start going, boo, your history is wrong, because this is where Portugal came in and gave Japan guns. And everyone's gonna be like, oh no, but they're samurai, they just use swords all the time, right? No, they did not. They actually used, arquebus, I think is the way you pronounce it. It's like a matchlock rifle, I guess. And you see it in, like, some period dramas, and it even shows up in Inuyasha. Like, they try to shoot Sesshomaru with it, and he just beats the little bullets away because he's, you know, main character. But anyway, they had guns now. So Portugal came over and said, hey, China's got this thing called gunpowder, and they've used it to put on the end of a pipe where they shoot little things out of it, and it blows holes in your armor. Why don't you take one? And Japan was like, good, give this to us! And in 10 years, everyone who had this arquebus technology was good at this arquebus technology. At the end of the Sengoku period, Japan had a new set of rules for combat, and a shit ton of guns. Now we go into the Azuchi Momoyama period, which is between the warring states and them being, like, reunited again. That's where the Azuchi Momoyama period is. It's at this point that the daimyo named Hideyoshi decided, well, China invaded us, why don't we invade China? Hideyoshi was not a smart man. So he tried, twice, to invade China. And using the guns that they'd gotten from the Portuguese, they managed to essentially roll up to Korea and then tell everyone to, you know, suck their nuts, and Korea got dunked by these guns that Japan had that Korea did not. So they basically walked through Korea, and one, like, sect of the army actually got all the way up to the top of Korea and crossed into China before they realized that the rest of the army wasn't as fast as them, so they had to retreat. So that happened twice, and it was insane that this guy tried to invade China twice, because they would get to China, and then China would be like, we were the ones that had the guns first, so fuck off, and Japan would be like, oh, touche, that's right. So they just, you know, went back to Japan, essentially. It was during this period, the Azuchi Momoyama period, that the clans that survived until the, like, 1800s and whatnot were really put together, because they swore their allegiance to the four, like, bloodline, pure bloodline clans, which I don't have in my notes for one reason or another. You can look those up if you want. Oda Nobunaga showed up in this period, and Oda Nobunaga is essentially the Lu Bu of Japan, because he was a badass, and he kicked a lot of people's butts. And he was known as this, like, superb samurai who gained enough rank as a samurai to become a daimyo. And it is his work that eventually laid down the tracks for the train of reunification to get to the end of that station and bring it all back together. Unfortunately, Oda Nobunaga, as badass as he was vulnerable to being stabbed in the stomach. And got stabbed in the stomach, in fact, by one of his own officers, who took a portion of Nobunaga's army and used it to kill Oda, which is kind of lame. Like, that incident is what led to Tokugawa Ieyasu, who is the guy who finished the job, to like, take up the reins. Before that happened, however, Totoyami Hideyoshi, who was the guy that invaded China, became Grand Minister and instated a law that states samurai were like a permanent and hereditary, like, class of person, and furthermore made it so that people who were not samurai were not allowed to carry weapons. Which means that if you were, like, a peasant or a commoner or something like that, you weren't allowed to carry weapons. And this is where we're gonna see, like, a lot of the stuff in dramas and whatnot where, like, you know, the commoners were oppressed by the samurai, but they weren't allowed to you know, fight back or anything because they didn't have any weapons, and etc., etc. And this is probably where people are going to start talking about, oh, isn't this where karate comes in? Because, you know, it was designed specifically to deal with people who were wearing wooden armor, etc., etc., that kind of thing. But that's where that whole, like, law that, you know, people who weren't samurai couldn't carry weapons came in. In the Tokugawa shogunate, this is also called the Edo period because it's when the capital of Japan was in Edo. During this period, samurai really didn't have anything to do because all the fighting was over. So they sort of returned back to being the, like, everyday life bureaucrats that they used to be back in, like, the Asuka period kind of thing. This is where the daisho tradition came around. The daisho, like the two swords that they would carry with them, the big one and the small one, the katana and the wakizashi, and then sometimes they'd also carry the knife with them, but everyone was allowed to carry the knife, essentially. But those two swords, like, they weren't there in case they needed to fight someone. They were more there as, like, a badge, like a status symbol, the kind of thing that was like, well, I've got these two swords, you can see that I've got them, and therefore I am a samurai. Therefore you have to be super nice and, like, have good manners and shit to me, because it's also legal for me to kill you if you aren't a samurai and don't show me the proper respect. And I don't know how, like, widely that was used, but it was a law that if you were a commoner and you didn't show the samurai the correct amount of respect that they deemed, you know, correct for that time, then they could kill you with one of their swords. Legally. So that must have been fun. There was no war happening, so Well, there was no reason for them to. So they sort of started devoting their time more to being scholars than being warriors, which is good because this is about the time when the code of Bushido started getting stricter and stricter, and it had to do more with like the Confucian ideal of piety and that kind of thing than it did with being an honorable warrior, because of course Ieyasu had to find a way to keep his samurai in line, for lack of a better term. Everything was going pretty well, everything was peaceful, and the samurai were being only moderate dicks. And then Perry showed up. Commodore Perry showed up with his giant amount of black ships, and essentially came up to Japan and said, "Give us your sweets or I'll bash your face in." Japan said, "Okay, please don't bash my face in, we'll open up our ports," because that's the metaphor for sweets in this thing. He forced Japan to open up their ports, and immediately, all of a sudden, Japan was, like, being exposed to these sort of things that they hadn't been exposed to ever because of their isolationism kind of thing. I mean, like, the closest thing to internationalization that they had was when the Portuguese gave them guns. So, they suddenly, like, had all this stuff going on, and they realized, having seen, you know, Commodore Perry's, like, crazy amount of ships and stuff, that they needed to update their army as well. In 1845, they opened up like a sort of naval warrior kind of school, and all the samurai, which used to be like a sort of land-based force with horses and stuff, started getting trained to be water-based fighters and warriors and stuff. You know, warriors on battleships and that kind of thing. The people that were good at that school would get sent to other places to study their techniques and you know, be good at fighting on the water kind of thing. So Japan started to like really super navalize itself. And then it was also during this period that they contacted other countries for like help building their own like fleets and armadas and stuff. Like, in fact, they contacted some French architects who built the armadas at Nagasaki and Yokosuka, which incidentally, Yokosuka is right here, right now. This video is being filmed in Yokosuka, so you are in a place by proxy that is part of Japanese history by like a large amount. This is where Perry came, by the way, as well, so. Then the Meiji Restoration started to come around. Emperor Meiji basically took the samurai and went, "We don't need you anymore, you are outdated, go away." And they sort of like, or he sort of like ousted the samurai class in favor of like a modernized military and police force. The first thing that he did was in the Meiji Restoration, and you'll see this in like Rurouni Kenshin and whatnot, when Kenshin's walking around carrying his sword, and everyone is like, "Ooh, you're not allowed to do that because that's not allowed anymore," kind of thing. That's where this comes in. In the Meiji Restoration, the emperor made it illegal to carry swords anymore. You weren't allowed to carry a sword. Which by extension meant that it was significantly more difficult to kill an insolent whelp if they didn't give you the proper respect. But then that was also made illegal anyway, so you couldn't do that anymore. Even if they were rude to you, you weren't allowed to just straight up kill them. Which, you know, progressive, good job Japan. The last time that, like, samurai as a ground sword fighting force were used was in 1877, yes, 1877, during the Satsuma Rebellion, wherein the, like, last vestiges of the samurai class that wanted to stay samurai and stay under the shogunate kind of thing fought with the people who didn't want that anymore and wanted to be under the emperor, and they got stomped, and then that was the end of the, like, samurai as a ground force. So we no longer had the sort of like sword-wielding, walking around with the top-knot samurai. When they were defeated there, that sort of set in motion the complete dissolution of the samurai class, and that was the last we really saw of them. Those who were samurai became the Shizoku class, which is essentially, I used to be a samurai, so now I get a salary kind of thing. It's like a retirement plan, I guess. But you know, they sort of just became like bureaucrat things again, and either that or they got like sent back to the schools to teach or something like that, but they weren't really considered soldiers anymore, so they got to sit around and get fat on whatever salary the government was giving them for having been samurai before. But even then, the Shizoku class was legally abolished forever on January 1st, 1947. So it is on January 1st, 1947 that the very last shreds of samurai were removed from history. That is the day that the samurai died. Ladies and gentlemen, you have just listened to an abridged and full of swearing version of the history of samurai from the very beginning in the Asuka period, where they were just bureaucrat people, to where they became a fighting force because they were trying to fight against the bureaucrat people, to where they had become like the government and were being dicks to people just like the government they were trying to fight, to where they went back to not being anything at all, and then finally they petered out. So, Reader's Digest plus swearing, I hope you enjoyed it. This is going to segue nicely into the next video, which I said that I wasn't going to tell you about, but because you've watched this far, I might as well. It'll be about Japan's Industrial Revolution. So, that'll be kind of fun to do. And then the episode after that is, by request, a history of Japanese animation, for use on somebody's anime club. Someone mentioned it on Twitter, I forget who. But whoever you were, you're going to be episode 4. So yeah, look forward to that. Thanks for watching, you guys. I'll see you on the next episode of History of Japanese Stuff. Later.